Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another incredible episode of Never Lost, where we retell the old fairy tales and folk stories so that they will never be forgotten. Today, I'm going to share a lovely folk tale from the Isle of Skye, which lies just off the northwest coast of Scotland. Skye is a beautiful island with a rich history. Its skyline is dominated by the stunning Cuillin Mountains, which stretch to almost a kilometre high and have a ridgeline which is 14 kilometres long. There was a heavy Norse influence on all of the Scottish islands, even those like Skye, which lie off the west coast, until the Treaty of Perth in 1266 assured King Alexander III of Scotland's ownership of our coastal islands. Not that ownership actually equated to peace. The Hebridean Islands were much like the rest of Scotland, in that they were at almost no time a unified people. They were populated by a collection of constantly warring clans and tribes. Even after the establishment of the Lords of the Isles, who became the largest landowners in the UK after the Kings of England and Scotland, many battles were still fought over control of the islands. But even though I could talk for hours about the MacDonalds and the MacLeods and their fight over the Isle of Skye, that's not why we're here. We're here to retell an old folk tale from the Isle of Skye. And today's story is called The Dream Makers, or as I like to call it, Cheese Dreams. So let's sit back and start the story. A lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens, a young woman lived in a small village on the Isle of Skye, in the shadow of the Black Cuillin Mountain. Her name was Flora, and she had always been a happy girl, kind and generous, as well as hard-working. However, Flora had also always been a little different. The other young women of her village seemed happy with their lot in life, content to marry one of the village's many young men and live out their lives as their mothers had done and their mothers before them. Flora wasn't dissatisfied with her life, but something inside her told her that there could be so much more, something new, something wonderful. One summer's day, all the young women from the village went out to pick brambles, bilberries and raspberries on the lower slope of the Black Cuillin Mountain. Their spirits were high as they walked as a group to the place where the best berries were to be found. They laughed and joked together as they talked about the boys in the village and who they might dance with at the next ceilidh in a few weeks. Flora joined briefly in their gossip and giggling, but she was well aware that such things were neither important nor the reason that they were out that day. After a short time, when the group reached the patches of berries, Flora walked ahead and began gathering the best of the berries that she could see, while the rest of the girls sat down and talked to each other. The pickings were good that day, and Flora continued to move farther away from the rest of the girls as she kept seeing better and better berries just a few steps more up the slope of the Black Cuillin. Although she was moving farther and farther away, Flora could still clearly hear the other girls behind her as they chatted and laughed. Farther and farther up the slope she went, gathering the finest berries that she had ever seen, not paying much mind to where she actually was, or which way she was heading, or how high up the Black Cuillin she had come. As so often happens on Skye and on the Cuillin Mountains, mists suddenly rolled in around her. It was a thick, blanketing mist that swept in quickly and covered the slopes of the mountain with a thick blanket of swirling white in moments. Flora couldn't see much farther than the length of her own arm in front of her face. The dense fog also seemed to muffle all sound, and Flora could barely hear her own footsteps in the eerily silent cloudscape which had descended upon her. Suddenly, she realized that she could no longer hear the noise of the other girls, and she had no idea where on the mountainside she was. She cried out in the hope that the other girls might hear her, but no answer came through the shifting mists. Flora tried for a short while to retrace her steps, hoping that the mists might pass, or at least clear enough that she could recognize where she was. However, the mists actually grew thicker, and before long Flora couldn't even see her feet below her as she tried to pick her way off the black coulee. As the mist thickened, the moisture in the air began to soak the ground, and Flora slipped more than once on the treacherous rock of the mountainside. The moisture also soaked into Flora's clothes, and the air grew colder, making her shiver. Flora knew she was in trouble. Cold, wet, and lost in the mist on a Scottish mountain is not a good place to be. But as bad as things were, they can always get worse. From out of sight in the mist, Flora began to hear strange, faint noises. The sound of something brushing past bushes not far away. The soft footfalls of something not human. The mist-muted grunts and snorts of some terrible beast or fey creature which could be stalking her through the thick fog. Flora was quite right to be afraid. There are a number of frightening fairy animals which might be prowling in an unnatural mist such as this. It could be the kelpie that was said to live in the depths of Loch Curusk at the base of the Black Coulee. Kelpies are water spirits that can appear on land as magnificent horses, often with silver bridles, but they are usually malevolent, dangerous creatures, and their true form is horrible to behold. Red, glowing eyes, like coals in a burning fire, and a mane and tail of twisted seaweed and kelp. They were known to drag people off into the loch or the river where they made their home and drown them. The sounds could even be a coo-shee, a dreadful demon hound as large as a cow with long, shaggy, dark green hair. Coo-shee are said to silently hunt the moors and mountains of Scotland's highlands and islands. They make almost no noise, except for 3 terrifying barks or howls. If you hear the first bark of a coo-shee, you must flee for the safety of 4 walls before you hear the third, because the final bark will paralyze any man or woman with a fear so deep it chills the very bones. It was creatures such as the kelpie or the coo-shee that Flora was afraid was stalking her in the thick, swirling mists. She froze in place and prayed that whatever she was hearing would pass her by without noticing her. But then the mist thinned ever so little in front of her to reveal a pair of eyes watching her from about 8 feet away. Even though she was terrified, she readied herself to run for her life when she noticed another pair of eyes, and then another. As a chilly gust of wind thinned the mist a little more, Flora laughed in relief as she saw that it was a herd of deer staring at her through the white fog. For a few moments the deer simply looked at Flora. Then they approached her, as quiet as ghosts, until she could make out at least a dozen of the creatures. The herd surrounded her, and Flora reached out and stroked the side of one of the deer as it came close. Its hair was cold and wet from the moisture of the mist. Another deer gently nuzzled her and looked her up and down with its large brown eyes. After a few moments, most of the herd began to slowly move off, but one pushed Flora's back with its head gently, as if encouraging her to go with them. Flora was unsure, but she thought the deer were sure-footed on the mountain, even in the thick mists, and although she may be lost, the deer seemed to know where they were going, which could hardly be much worse than where she was now. So Flora placed her hand on the rump of one of the deer and let herself be led off through the mists to wherever the herd took her. They walked for what seemed like a long time, across and up the Black Coulee, on paths that Flora had never walked before. Eventually, through the mist, Flora made out the mouth of a cave ahead of her, and she knew that this was where the deer had been leading her. As she neared the entrance, Flora saw that there was an old woman just inside the cave. The old woman was kneeling on the ground and using a small quernstone to grind something. Flora had never heard of any witch, hermit, or henwife who lived on the Black Coolin Mountain, but she had no idea where she was or how long it might take her to get back, and the mist was still thick in the air. So Flora approached the old woman and addressed her politely from just outside the cave. "Excuse me, mistress, but I am terribly lost in the mists which have covered the mountain. Cold to the bone I was, and wet to the skin, when some deer found me and led me here to your cave. Would it be all right if I stayed here for the night until the mists have lifted and I can find my way home? I offer to share all that I have in exchange." Flora held out the basket of bilberries and raspberries and brambles which she had gathered earlier and which was still clutched in one arm. The old woman looked up from her work with the quernstone and looked intently at Flora. Then she rose and slowly came to the entrance of the cave. Her thin white hair hung like wisps of mist around her shoulders. Her wrinkled nose twitched as she seemed to be sniffing the air around Flora. She looked deep in thought for a few moments, and then she reached out one withered hand and took the basket of berries, inspecting it. The woman then raised one finger of the other hand, indicating that Flora should wait, and she turned and went back into the cave. Flora peered into the cave after her, and as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she made out another figure at the back of the cave who she hadn't noticed before. The other person was an old man who was seated on a small stool and looking intently down into a pool or a spring on the cave floor. The woman had seemed older than anybody who Flora had ever met, but the old man appeared ancient. His skin hung off his stick-thin arms and legs, and his face looked not just wrinkled, but marked by the cracks of antiquity. He also sat with a stillness that made Flora think that she was looking at a statue made of stone. The old woman shuffled over to him and spoke softly into his ear. Flora tried to hear what she said, but it was like no words she had ever heard. It sounded like some ancient language. The old man ponderously turned his head to face Flora and looked at her with a gaze even more piercing than the old woman's. Flora thought that she could make out his mouth moving in speech, but his voice must have been as soft as a whisper, for she heard nothing. The old woman nodded and came back to the cave mouth and spoke for the first time. "Although we see and ken your plight, you may not stay for just one night. This cave is hidden by these mists, and naebody kens it even exists. The only reason you got here was wi' the help o' the herd o' deer. If ye wish to bide and stay, it can only be for a year and a day." Flora looked at the old woman, who smiled back and said, "It's not an easy choice, I ken, and if ye want to go, the deer will lead ye home again to the village far below." Flora looked back at the mists behind her. The deer were still standing there, watching her, as if waiting for her decision. She thought about her village and her life for the past 17 years, her friends who she had left hours ago, gossiping and giggling together somewhere through the mists. She liked them well enough, but they were so preoccupied with boys and so satisfied to accept the role that was expected of them. Suddenly, she felt sure that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and that this could be the start of something new and something wonderful. And so, smiling, Flora looked up at the old woman and said that she would be happy to stay for a year and a day. The old woman smiled back warmly stepped aside and gestured Flora into the cave. As soon as Flora was across the threshold, she felt the difference in temperature from the outside. There was no fire burning in the cave, but it felt as warm as any cottage sitting room. The only dim light in the cave was coming from faintly glowing mosses and lichens, which were growing down the walls and the roof, which glowed with blues and greens. The old woman gave Flora a plate of bannocks, served with a type of Scottish cheese called crowdie, and a pile of the berries which Flora had given her. She explained that now, for a year and a day, Flora would stay with her and the old man and help them at their work. On the day Flora left, she would be rewarded for her service. The next morning, Flora rose with the sunrise and began eagerly helping the old couple. In the early hours every day she would go out with the old woman, collecting herbs and plants and roots from the mountainside, and the old woman taught Flora the many uses of these plants and how to prepare them. Heather flower as an antiseptic, poppies as a sedative, and carline thistle as an antibiotic. Nettles for skin conditions, betony for an infected wound, figwort for cuts and sores, and bog myrtle to repel midges. Flora also helped to milk the herd of deer which came each day to the cave. Then, along with the old woman, she would grind special herbs and plants and mix these in with the milk. When the fragrant mixture was ready, the old woman would place a large pot of it on a pile of stones inside the cave and speak words in the strange ancient language that she and the old man conversed in. The stones would start to give off heat like a small fire, and the milky mixture was boiled into curds, which were dried and made into the soft crowdie cheese. When the soft cheese was ready, a small amount was set aside for eating, but most of it was taken to the old man, who sat constantly staring into the pool of water at the back of the cave. He would pick up a lump of it and begin working the soft cheese in his gnarled old hands. He never took his eyes off the water as he worked, moulding and shaping the cheese into crude statues of things. Some looked like people, some like horses or cattle. Others resembled cottages or maybe castles. Each evening, before sunset, the old man would rise and go to the mouth of the cave with his creations, and one at a time he would hold them up to the sky. When he did this, birds would come to him and take them from his hands and fly off. To his right hand would come songbirds, thrushes, and blackbirds, and to his left hand would come the scavengers, hoodie crows and magpies and seagulls. As time passed, the old woman taught Flora the meaning of the true work which she and the old man did. The spring at the back of the cave was a rare pool, which was connected to the well of life itself. By staring into the waters, the old man could see the hearts and the minds of the people, their hopes, their aspirations, and their dreams. That was what the old man's creations truly were, the dreams of men and women. For they too were the dream makers. The songbirds that came to the old man's right hand took happy dreams to the peoples of the land below, and the scavengers that came to his left hand took nightmares. Flora helped to make the cheese each day, and she watched the old man at his work. Although she couldn't fashion dreams herself as he did, she learned a great deal about them by looking into the pool which sprung from the well of life. She learned what they could mean and how to interpret them. The days passed faster than Flora realized, as she learned and absorbed all that she could from the dream makers of the Black Cuillin. Before she knew it, the year and a day was up, and it was time for her to leave the cave and the ancient couple. The old woman gestured for Flora to come to the cave entrance, where the herd of deer had assembled and seemed to be waiting for her. She gave Flora a number of remedies and medicines, and then said to her, "Pleased we have been to have you here for one whole day and one whole year. Go now, while the mists are thinning. Your reward awaits at your journey's beginning." Flora thanked the old woman and the man for all that they had taught her. Then she turned and left the cave and followed the deer out into the mists. The deer again led Flora through the swirling whiteness along paths that she had never tread. When they finally came down out of the mists, she realized that she was not, it seemed, still on the Black Cuillin Mountain, and the deer were apparently not leading her back to her village. In fact, through some magic or wonder, she saw that she was being led down the west side of the Red Cuillin Mountains, on the other side of the Island of Skye. After a short time, she came to a cove on the west side of the island. The deer ushered Flora down to the beach by the shoreline. Once she was near to the waterline, the whole herd of deer stopped and stood looking out to sea expectantly. Flora waited with the deer until on the horizon, on the ocean, she saw a small shape bobbing on the waves. As she watched, the little speck grew larger as whatever it was drew closer to the beach. Soon, Flora could make out the shape of a small coracle being paddled by a sailor slowly coming towards her. A coracle is a round boat made of tightly woven wicker, which is then covered with waterproof hides. The sailor piloting the small coracle was a fine young man with long, blonde hair, which was caught by the sea breeze and whipped around his shoulders. When he was near enough that she could see him properly, Flora noted his deep blue eyes, which reflected the ocean, and the excited and the happy look on his bright young face. A golden torque about his neck glinted in the bright sunlight. Flora had never seen the sailor before, but somehow she felt that she knew him from somewhere. When he reached the shallows, he jumped from the coracle into the surf, and he drew the small boat out onto the sand. Then he ran up to Flora and stopped in front of her, exclaiming, "It's you! It's really you! For a year and a day I have dreamed of you from my father's house across the sea. Your eyes have near haunted my sleep, and your face has ever been in my thoughts since I first beheld it. And now, here you are." He reached out his hand and said, "Come with me." Flora glanced behind her. The herd of deer were still standing, watching, as if awaiting some decision from her. She thought briefly about her parents and her village, which she hadn't seen for so long. But then she remembered the final words the old woman had spoken to her when she left the cave of the dream makers. Your reward awaits you at your journey's beginning. Flora took the young sailor's hand, and he helped her into the coracle. Then he pushed it back out into the waves and jumped in himself. As the sailor paddled the boat out to sea, Flora glanced back and saw the herd of deer turn and begin to make their way back to the hidden place that they had come from. She picked up a second paddle and began to help her sailor propel the coracle and herself towards something new, something wonderful. Flora went with the sailor, and she became a wife and a mother and a queen in a land far to the west, which is lost to us now. There she taught the people, her people, all about herbs and plants and dreams, and all that she had learned from the old man and woman, the dream makers. That is the end of the story of the dream makers of the Black Cuillin Mountain. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you did, leave a comment or just hit that like button. Thank you so much for joining me. And I very much hope to see you next story.